Hello everyone! Today we're in downtown Lake Orion on the trail of a serial killer who visited Lake Orion and North Oakland County in the late 1960s after leaving his home stomping grounds of northern Kentucky and southern Ohio and eventually turning down there to finally be apprehended and brought back to justice here in Michigan. It's quite an involved story. We're going to just give you the highlights and share what happened here in Lake Orion and Pontiac in 1968 and 1969. And here's our killer right now, Nolan Ray George, age 76 currently, from London, Kentucky, a 5th grade dropout at the age of 13, who eventually left that area, settling in Pontiac, Michigan in the mid-1960s. His first victim grew up in a house right behind these two here on Broadway Street, where the big condo is behind there. And that was Gwendolen Dorothy Gosley, who was a Lake Orion High School graduate of the class of 1950. She had since married a man named Perry and lived in Pontiac and had 3 children. Worked at the cashier at the Kmart store on Glenwood Avenue. And here's her house on Anderson Street. But in December of 1968, she somehow met up with Mr. George, the killer, and was taken to Giddings Road, where she was assaulted and murdered by Mr. George and dumped in a field just north of Perry Street. And remember, back then, this street was a dirt road, very, very sparsely traveled, and only a couple of little houses and farmsteads at the northern end of it up by Walton Boulevard. In 1968, it was a lot different than it is now, and a lot less traffic. But right in this marshy area right here is where a passerby discovered her body the day after she was killed. And this is just the only other victim that we know about in Michigan, before he went on just 3 months later to kill Frances Brown, age 22, of Lake Orion. Frances Brown was not from Lake Orion, but had settled here after splitting up from her husband, who was still living in California, and she worked at a company called 4 Star Corporation. On March 15th, she left her home in Lake Orion and came downtown to have a little social time and ended up here at the Verwood Hotel and Bar on South Broadway Street. And this is where she would meet up with her killer and be found the next morning, well, 2 a.m. the following morning, by Lake Orion police officer Earl Reinhardt. And here's an image of the Lake Orion Review news story about the incident. This is the house that she lived in as it looks today, the green one, on South Slater Street. Just a short walk from the Verwood Bar, Royal Lounge, or the Wagon Wheel Saloon. A future article stated that the police identified the owner of the car she was found in and cleared him from the crime, and that the killer owned a 1962 Chevy similar to this one. It's unclear whether it turned out to be the same person, the same car that she was found in, or whether he had just found a random car to take her to and commit the murder. The discovery was made behind the current AutoZone building, which at the time was sitting empty, having recently been occupied by the A&P grocery store that had by this time moved to the plaza south of town where Advanced Auto is now. And you can see over here behind the building the back of the Verwood Hotel right there, and their little parking lot they had. So it could have been parked there, but I think more likely for privacy it would have been parked right behind the A&P store, as the story indicates, because this area was much more heavily wooded back then with overgrowth and shrubbery and the debris from the old train station that had left its foundation here. So it looked a lot different than it does now. Within a couple weeks, the killer was arrested based on tips and information gathered during the investigation. But then the case gets a little sketchy, and we've got some bad legal work by the prosecutors and judges at the time, I gotta say. It's pretty sad what happens next. Bargained a second-degree murder during the trial process before the trial was over, and he was sentenced to 40 to 60 years in Michigan prison. His court-appointed attorney immediately requested a retrial because of violation of his Miranda rights. The retrial was granted and ended in a hung jury. They requested another trial. On the third trial, he ended up being convicted and sentenced to 40 to 60 years. He served a little over 10 years in Michigan prisons before being released in December of 1981. And it was fairly common back then for especially second-degree murder convictions to result in prison terms of less than 15 years, some even as low as 6 or 7 years. While he was in jail, they had questioned him about the other murder that I told you about, the one of Mrs. Perry, formerly of Lake Orion, who lived in Pontiac. And he had confessed to that crime with the coercion of the investigator telling him that it wouldn't be held against him because he was already in prison for murder. Just 11 months after being released from prison in Michigan, he murdered 26-year-old Cindy Rose in Butler County, Ohio, using the same M.O. that he had for the murders in Michigan. The victim was found partially clothed with a stocking around her neck. He was identified and arrested based on a fingerprint found on a nearby beer can. Convicted and sentenced to prison, he served 10 years for this murder. From 92 through 2010, he kept a low profile. The police were aware of him, the Michigan authorities were aware of him, and were seeking an extradition order to bring him back to Michigan, but they had to clear up the issue of whether or not he had been promised immunity in the case of Ms. Brown. So, when that was all resolved, the state issued an arrest warrant for him, and then Ohio went to work trying to get him and bring him back. And finally, in 2010, he was picked up at a motel and returned to Michigan after a lengthy extradition process, which he fought all the way. In 2011, he was convicted of first-degree murder of Mrs. Perry and sent to prison for life. Just a few months before the initial investigating officer from Lake Orion Police Department passed away after a long and dedicated career in public service in North Oakland County. So I hope everybody forgets the name of this terrible human being who's in prison for the rest of his life here in Michigan, but instead remember the names of the victims and the police officers who worked tirelessly to bring him to justice, including Lake Orion's own Earl Reinhardt, who served the Lake Orion Department for many years, was active in multiple civic organizations, local community endeavors, and was a well-respected member of the community.